Welcome to this e-learning series on public-private partnerships brought to you by the World Bank and TIFID. In this module, we will discuss public-private partnership project identification and screening. In the previous module, we introduced you to the concept of public-private partnerships. We looked at the definition, structuring options, the rationale, as well as the various frameworks for implementing public-private partnerships. It is important to remind you that the mode we use to equip you with knowledge of PPPs is a participatory one. That means as you go through this module, you will be able to draw on the experience of others, such as yourself. So let's begin by taking a look at how to identify public-private partnership projects. One of the expensive items with public-private partnership procurement is the feasibility study, which requires a lot of times various experts, legal experts, technical experts, financial experts. Those are resources you have to spend money on. Again, you don't want to be spending that money chasing it down a blind alley where there's no likelihood of success. If a project you find out is not going to be a good project as a public-private partnership, does not mean it's a bad project. One of the things I want to make clear is, as much as I like public-private partnerships, not every project is suitable to be a public-private partnership. Hopefully, a lot of this stuff, particularly the screening exercise, or let me rephrase that, the screening function of PPP identification, you should be able to do most of that internally without having to engage outside resources. You may need a little bit of help from the outside, but this is, relatively quick. We're going to focus first on our identification. Is it a good project? There's some things that we're going to use in here, including needs analysis, cost-benefit analysis, pre-feasibility analysis. By the way, if I were to say, if I'm the Minister of Finance and I ask you to look at a project and identify, well, we've identified it, but I want you to screen it, how long do you think that might take in terms of months? How long do you think it might take? Does it take a year? Can you do the work in a month? 6 months? It takes a relatively short time. You should be able to do this in maybe sometimes 2 months, 4 months, probably no more than 6. So this is another way of looking at it. So very importantly, this is our objective. We're going to see if our project meets some basic criteria, which you'll see in a moment. Importantly, the threshold question is it going to be a good project? If it's a bad project, regardless of how it's delivered, whether it's delivered through traditional public finance or if it's delivered through a public-private partnership, a public-private partnership cannot turn a bad project into a good project. There's some projects that just don't make sense for a variety of reasons, and it just doesn't matter how you're going to pay for it. If it's not a good project, you don't pursue it. What do you think the most important thing is in identifying a good project?
Maybe I will think of, is it applicable? Can it be in practice?
Another way of saying that, do we need it? Right? We always start with, is the project actually needed? Again, it has nothing to do with whether it's a public-private partnership or whether it's going to be paid for by the government. You start out, do we need it? If you don't need it, then you don't bother with it. Don't waste your time. So let's look at what makes a good project. Okay? We've got to have a good definition of what it's going to do. That's our scope. Do we have a real need for the project? And the real need is, does it serve the public interest? We want to make sure it's sustainable environmentally and socially. certainly has to comply with all our regulations, particularly with regards to safety and in the environment. Can we physically do it? And is it financially sound? A story I like to tell that occurred in our country, in the United States. There was, some of you probably have heard of the state of Alaska. It's way in the north. It's a big, giant state. It's our largest state. It's also, I believe, our least populous state. It's certainly the least densely populated state. It's just a lot of ice up there. Well, anyways, there was a fairly powerful senator in our legislature, our Congress, who decided that there was a little island off the coast of Alaska, and he decided he wanted a bridge to be built for the people on that island. And he was very powerful in Washington, our capital, and he was able to get millions and millions of dollars appropriated to build the bridge. And there were very few people that lived on this island. And it became a bit of a scandal when it said people started calling it a bridge to nowhere, because the bridge was just going to this island. There were just a handful of people that lived on the island. And it turned out it would have been much cheaper simply to buy everybody on the island a boat rather than to build a bridge that was going to cost tens of millions of dollars. So the bridge was not financially feasible, nor was it affordable. Affordability, remember, we still have, particularly in public-private partnerships, this tension between affordability and bankability. But even if the project's going to be delivered through public finance means, you have to make that determination, is it going to be affordable? So let's talk about identifying projects. Has nothing to do with public-private partnerships, but government identifies projects all the time. What is the government, where do you find government projects in your just routine processes, whether it's at the local level, whether it's at the national level? Where in the government process are projects identified, potential projects? If you were asked today, let's say you're out of government and now you're a consultant, and you said, I want to know, your boss tells you, find me a list of projects the government's considering funding. Forget about, has nothing to do with public-private partnerships. Where would you look? You find it in the budget, right? Governments have capital budgets. There's operating budgets that pay for the government to run every day. And there are capital budgets that are designed to fund very large projects, basically infrastructure projects. So we have all these different sources, like the national development plans. Those are planning documents. You will see what we call infrastructure gap analyses. A lot of times, multilateral institutions such as the World Bank will perform these. There will be projects that your prime minister, your political leaders will push. They'll be advocates for. Sometimes even in their campaigns, they will run with promises to have something built. And there's always a review of the existing assets. As we know, our assets, government assets, tend to get run down through deferred maintenance, and occasionally those will be surveyed and needs will be identified. The other thing that you'll find where you find different projects, you can create a list of projects, they're actually from the stakeholders. Sometimes they're internal, such as the agencies and ministries. Those who are in local government, you have needs as well. You'll identify needs that either get funded locally or you need assistance from the national government for. Your constituents, they will let you know what they need in terms of infrastructure. NGOs, non-governmental organizations, similarly will do that. This happens to be from Kenya. So this is just a development plan. So we mentioned budget documents, particularly our capital budgets are a good source of material. In our large infrastructure assets, such as airports, they will have airport improvement plans, capital improvement plans. There are real estate master plans. The ports, our ports have master plans on what they want to see built, how they'd like to see it built. The other thing is, to have a successful PPP program, it's good to have what we call a pipeline of projects, a list of viable projects. You have to understand that a lot of the private parties that propose on these projects are from other parts of the world. They're multinational companies. So they're looking around the world. So whether you're in Tanzania, Kenya, South Africa, wherever you're from, you're competing with other parts of the world. You're competing with Vietnam, the Philippines, Colombia, and South America, all around the world. So these companies, one of the things they like to do as they look at projects, they're not very interested in like, oh, this country is only going to do one public-private partnership. This is it. We'll find out tomorrow during our feasibility session that there's a lot of due diligence involved in learning the country's laws, the processes, et cetera. Well, that knowledge that these companies gain, they want to be able to apply it to additional projects so that they're not just simply investing their money in a potential project, they're investing their time and money in a process. So they like to see a pipeline of projects. But that pipeline has to be serious. Without picking on any particular country, but these are two real examples. One country, relatively small, has had a pretty good experience, good track record with public-private partnerships. They do maybe one or two large PPPs a year, but they're fairly steady. They publish a pipeline of future projects that they're considering. In fact, one of the things that they do is, under their law, they review their capital budget. I believe it's twice a year. So anything that the government might be proposing that it needs, new water system, new road, new bridge, whatever, they actually have to make a decision whether it's going to be done traditionally or as a public-private partnership. So they scrub their capital budget, or if you will, mine the budget to see what's potential PPP. So they're very serious about it. And the market, that is the private investors, they take them very seriously as well. Subsequently, they've had a fairly successful PPP program. And this other country, which is kind of slow and steady, been performing these projects, I was meeting with them and they were just laughing. They're like 72 projects. They haven't done one. Like they haven't put any time into just, really thinking this through on what's suitable as a public-private partnership. So it's very important in terms of the market taking you seriously. We have these government sources for identifying public-private partnerships, our budget documents, our planning documents, maybe leadership, what our political leadership wants to pursue. But the other thing that happens is the private sector will suggest projects. So if you think about it, like the hotel that we were in, there was not a procurement, a request for qualifications, a request for proposals to build this hotel. The office buildings downtown, in the center of the city. Similarly, there was no formal procurement. Most things get built by negotiation. Somebody comes up with an idea. They approach someone that may own the land, for instance. They say, I want to build this here. I'll pay you this much. They go back and forth, have a negotiation. They come to terms, and voila, they start building a project. That's, in the commercial world, that's how most things get built. In the public sector, we have more formalized procurement for good reason, because we have to be responsible for taxpayers' money. We have to make sure the project's in the public interest and all those good things. So we have unsolicited proposals where the private sector will identify a need that is not being met by the government, or sometimes even the government has identified what the need is but hasn't come up with a solution. And the private sector sees an opportunity to fulfill that need. Does anyone know what that is from your history?
Trojan horse.
The Trojan horse, yes, very good. So if you know your ancient history, this was the city of Troy, and the Greeks had laid siege to the city of Troy for a long time. And one day, the Trojans, that's what they called the citizens of Troy, they saw this horse given as a gift, a wooden horse, big, large wooden horse, and they saw the Greek ships sail off at night. And they're like, the siege is over, the Greeks have given up, and our trials are gone. Well, beware of Greeks bearing gifts. The Trojan horse turned out contained commandos, special forces. At night, opened up. They were able to open up the gates of Troy. The Greek ships had sailed back in at night, and they took over the city. So you have to treat unsolicited proposals very carefully, all right? So let's talk about our pre-feasibility analysis. What we're trying to answer here is the project a good project regardless of how it's going to be delivered? We want to, in our feasibility, what we want to look for, are there any obstacles that are going to be a showstopper? What would stop us from being able to pursue a project?
I think what might stop us from pursuing a project is if we see from feasibility studies, we actually try to analyze a lot of things. Example, environmental stuff, if the project is environmentally friendly, if it's really acceptable to the community, like if it's there, the culture of the society of the community, and if it's really affordable.
Right,
Yeah.
Those are all good things. If, for instance, let's talk about acceptability. If the people don't want it,
Yeah, if the people that don't,
that could be a problem.
they don't get the community support.
If it's going to create an environmental condition, that's going to be a problem.
Yes.
What are some other things that could stop us from pursuing a project?
I think on the issue of resource, availability of resource, because the resource can create the cost, how the resource can influence the cost of that of output, which need to be intended to that project resources.
Right, so lack of resources. What else could stop a project?
Also, I can say political will. If the leaders in the regime cannot support, the project cannot be done.
Right, you got to have the political will. Anything else?
Financial constraints. If
Financial
you don't have
constraints?
enough money,
Yep.
you cannot do a project.
What about, is it legal to do? When that airport project I mentioned in my bio, I remember this date very succinctly. It was the governor wanted to meet me in his office. I went to his office, and he told me, John, I want you to sell Stewart International Airport. Privatize it. He wanted to divest the state of it. He wanted me to sell it. And I looked at the governor. I said, that's wonderful, except that's also illegal. U.S. law doesn't allow you to do that. And he was the governor. And he said, I didn't ask you for a legal opinion. I'm telling you what I want you to do. And so, being a good government employee, salute, and figured it out. That's one of the things, by the way, the pre-feasibility study, you can identify obstacles, but in identifying the obstacles, it doesn't mean you're stopped. You might come up with a list of obstacles. What that identification of obstacles does is that, okay, is there a solution? And then you start asking those questions. When I told the governor it was illegal, which it was, to sell the airport, then we had to figure out a legal solution to doing so. It actually required an act of Congress to change the law, which we did. But then you have to ask yourself the question, is it feasible, is it possible to even change the law? It turned out it was. So those are some of the things we do. So here are some of the key components to pre-feasibility. Is our legal? Do we have the legal authority to do this? As I said, with my initial 5-minute legal feasibility analysis in the governor's office when he asked me to do that was no, it's not legal. Are there legal approvals required? So different permits, for instance. Do we need to amend the law? Okay. Is it technically possible to do this? You want to have a new bridge built, but where you want the bridge built might be the soil might not be sufficient to support the project. There might be seismic conditions. Might not be good approaches to the bridge, for instance. So we want to take a look at all the technical issues surrounding the project. Importantly, if it's a project that's going to rely on, say, user fees, like a toll bridge or a toll road, or new power generation, new water system, where there are going to be tariffs, are the fees going to be sufficient, or is not really necessarily the fees, but is there actually enough demand for the project? You don't want to have a situation where no one's using the road. A story I like is not far from where Ned and I live in the United States. A private company, an Australian company, investing in the United States, built a new toll road to relieve traffic congestion. And on the first day, so toll roads are really sensitive to demand. You have to have enough vehicles using the road to make it financially feasible. So this was a big investment, $2 billion US. So on the first day the road opened, the Australian company Transurban, they have a command center. The road is very modern, has cameras so it can monitor traffic and accidents, has wonderful signage. And so they have this control center with all these monitors. And the road was opening up, I believe, at 6 a.m. was on the first day, 6 o'clock in the morning. And in the control center, they had certainly the executives from Transurban. They had their bankers who had lent millions and millions of dollars to the project. They had the other investors. They had what would be comparable to your Minister of Transportation was there. From the federal government, the state government's minister, we call him a Secretary of Transportation, was there as well. So all these dignitaries were there. And the road opened and they were, all ready to pop the champagne and clap and everything. So 6 o'clock the road opens and they're watching the monitors to see all the cars come through, and there's no cars. And it's 6:05 and still no cars. It's now 10 after 6, no cars. At 6:15, a car finally goes through and everybody starts clapping, yay! At 6:17, a second car comes through. They're like, yay, oh no, that car got in an accident. Nobody got hurt, but it got in an accident. They're like, so the road is successful, by the way, and there's enough demand for it. But demand is very critical in these user fee arrangements. Going back to, say, the toll road. Okay, if it's going to be a toll, for instance, a user fee, what does it need to be to support the project? And, by the way, is that fee affordable to the users of the project? There was a tunnel project done as a public-private partnership. In this case, it was a Swedish company. that proposed it. By the way, it was an unsolicited proposal. So they proposed it, and they went to the government, and they said, you have 2 existing tunnels. They're deteriorating. We will repair those tunnels, and we will build you a 3rd tunnel. And the government said, how much will that cost us? 0. We'll pay for all of it. As long as we can levy a toll of, say, $5 US, we don't need any support from the government. We'll build it. We'll pay for it. You don't have to do anything. The government's like, wow, that sounds like a great deal. Let's do it. Well, it certainly was affordable to the government, right? Because the government's not going to have to pay anything. Well, guess what happened? Who do you think may have started complaining? Who's that? The users, the drivers. So the driver's like, wait a minute. I've been using these tunnels for 20 years and there was no toll on them. Now I need to use this tunnel to get to work. I got to pay $5 each way, $10 a day, $50 a week, $200 a month, almost $2,500 a year. So they started complaining. So you have to figure out, is it affordable? And when we talk about how to finance these projects, we might even use that one as an example, because that turned out to be a really interesting example of balancing affordability and bankability. So financially, can we do it? Is there going to be government subsidies going to be required to make the project happen? Understand this, in public-private partnerships, it does not necessarily mean that the private sector will fund a project 100%. A public-private partnership can involve public financing. It just might be a lower level of public financing than if it was done through traditional means. All right, so affordability, bankability, those are the key questions in our financial analysis. Social and environmental feasibility. What are the social impacts going to be? If we were going to build a new road, what would be a major social impact? Families, businesses might be displaced. All right, that's a big impact. It needs to be studied. Are there any ways that we can mitigate these things? Sometimes they're simply unavoidable, and the need might be so great that it has to be done. But is there a way that we can lessen the impacts? When we look at a project, let's say we identify a need, the need is genuine, that we need to provide more electric power to an area. Okay? How can we do it? What are the options? And you don't have to be an engineer or anything of that nature. What can we do how can we provide more power? What are some of the means of doing so? How can we generate more power? I'll give you a simple example. We could have another power plant that uses coal, for instance. What else can we do?
Hydroelectric, geothermal. Yeah, there are a lot of alternatives.
Right. So we have all sorts of options. You mentioned geothermal. We could have hydropower. We could have solar power. We could have wind power. We could have coal power. We can have gas-fired turbines. You can have even nuclear power, right? So there's different ways of generating power. Those are different options. And some, if you're here in Dar es Salaam, hydropower is probably not an option. It's not as if there's a waterfall nearby where we're going to generate hydropower. So boom, you don't even worry about that one, right? If you want to use coal, can you ship the coal here? But the other thing, right, and that might not be feasible. The other thing you find in different parts of the world, coal actually is kind of dirty, in terms of contributing to air pollution. So you have options. Well, one of the things we want to do is we want to figure out what the options are to delivering something. And there's different solutions to the problem. There's what we call non-asset solutions, existing asset solutions, new asset solutions. So for instance, and I stole this cartoon from my colleague Ned, but so a lot of places here in Tanzania, here in East Africa, there's a need for clean water. Well, there's all sorts of options for doing so. So we could build a new dam in this case, there's river sharing, you could build a desalination plant, which is rather expensive. Well, sometimes the simple solution is just fix your existing water system, stop the leaks. You know, you don't need to build something new, just repair what you have. All right? So that would be an existing asset solution. Okay? A new asset solution would be, say, building a new dam. By the way, what do you think non-asset solution, which sounds like a great consulting phrase, what do you think a non-asset solution might be? Let's say we have an issue with our water system where there's insufficient clean water being produced. What's a non-asset solution, possibly? Non-asset solution refers to maybe it's the management. Maybe we need better management practices. Maybe we need new managers. So that could just be the solution itself. All right? So part of our screening is looking at what the possible options could be to deliver that. So this is something you may use. It's just a simple description of what we call an options template, looking at it. And of course, you start out with what the name of the project is. It's described. Here's our needs issue, which is always very important. Is it within the contracting authority, the ministry, for instance? Is it within their strategic plans to do? And here are the different options. Maybe you come up with 3 different options, and then you just describe the options. Operationally, what the cost might be, and the cost might be very preliminary. Is there possible private sector interest in the project? And then you recommend what the option is. All right, so is a project suitable for a public-private partnership? If you're going to take a look at the suitability of a project for a public-private partnership, what are some of the questions you're going to ask? So we've talked about what we called pre-feasibility, if you will. You know, is it legally possible to do? Is it technically possible? And that was just looking at the project itself without even thinking of whether it's a public-private partnership or not. Now I want to ask you, as a public-private partnership, does it have characteristics that lend itself to being a PPP? So what are some of the things you would ask yourself? What do you think the characteristics might be? So going back again to yesterday, I asked the question and you answered it. What's the most embarrassing thing that could happen in a procurement? Right, no one shows up, no one's interested. You want to know, if we do this, are folks going to show up? So there's some really simple questions you can ask yourself in your analysis. And again, you don't need to go out and do a lot of physical work. You could do this on your computer. Has anyone ever done this as a public-private partnership? Has it been done in our country? Has it been done in a neighboring country? Has it been done on the continent? Are there examples of this? So is there a market to pursue this kind of a project? Right? That's a really basic, simple question. If it's never been done before, it's going to be kind of tough. It doesn't mean it's impossible, but I'm not sure you want to be the pioneer. It's going to be a difficult road to travel. Again, in our suitability analysis, we start with public service. Is it going to serve the public interest? So our objective, risk, right? Go back to what we talked about yesterday in terms of the characteristics of a public-private partnership and the different things such as risk, right? Is it a project that would lend itself to transferring a fair amount of risk to the private sector? So we want to make sure we can transfer risks. Project size is important for public-private partnership suitability. Remember, public-private partnership procurement, you probably need outside experts. It's going to take longer. The project itself may very well deliver better value, but the procurement itself could be rather expensive. So one of the things you want to do is it's sometimes difficult, not impossible, but it might not be cost effective to pursue a public-private partnership for a very small project. Basically, the squeeze might not be worth the juice. You might have to end up spending a lot of money for a rather small project. So generally, the larger the project, the better it is for a public-private partnership. It justifies the transaction costs. We want to know, do we have any early plans for the project? Are the reasons, the motivations for the government to pursue the public-private partnership, are they sound? This is what we had just discussed. Is the market experienced with these projects? Are they familiar to them? Is there this is part of our market sounding, if you will. Here's our acceptability question. Will the population embrace it? If we require donor institutions to support it, are they going to be on board? Here's our legal authority. Can we do it? Institutionally, is there the capacity not only for procuring the project, but monitoring and evaluating it? Here's again our market question. Is there enough private sector interest in the project? Can the project, if it's done as a public-private partnership, can it get financed? Meaning, are there banks in place that would lend the money, the billions in shillings that might be required to make the project a go? One of the things as soon-to-be private partnership experts, when you're starting to look at a potential project, you want to engage in a market sounding, see who might be interested in doing so. I'm involved in one currently. This evening I have a conference call with a company on that matter. But you also want to know, you want to reach out to, say, the banks, the lenders, to see if they would have interest in financing one of these projects. If their interest is very low, or they tell you it can't be done, it gives you an idea of whether the project's going to be suitable or not. This is what we would call a dashboard, if you will. But this was an actual project. My friends from Zanzibar would know this project. It's not necessarily going to happen, but this was looking at a new port terminal, basically for fuel in Zanzibar. And there were a number of criteria that were used. Here's technical feasibility, legal feasibility, environmental feasibility were scored. And you can see some of the comments here. But it's basically a very simple analysis, pass-fail, that gives you some feel for whether the project could be done as a public-private partnership. Anything green is generally yes. Red, if it's red, no. You don't necessarily need to worry about the actual score. In this case, 89 out of 100. That's not the important part. Essentially, this is generated from an Excel spreadsheet where you would end up scoring each of these criteria and it would give you a result. Very, very elegant little tool that's used by advisors to look at viability issues. So if we make a finding that the project is viable, then what do we do? All right? Well, we ask ourselves the question, are we going to move forward with the project? And then we ask ourselves the question, are we going to move forward with the project as a public-private partnership? So let's say the project looks like a good project, but it doesn't, the answer is no in terms of it being a public-private partnership project. That does not mean it's a bad project. It just means that, it's going to be difficult to attract private sector interest in this project. But it's still, the need might be so great that the government should move ahead and fund the project. There are a lot of benefits of public-private partnerships that extend beyond the project itself. Two of them are, one is economic development, and one is expanding your budget. If you think about it, in your government, various governments, whether at the national or the local level, you have a capital budget. The capital budget is essentially a wish list of projects. I don't care if you're in Tanzania, Zanzibar, Kenya, Canada, the United States, Australia, gotta remember Craig. Capital budgets are almost always underfunded. There's never enough money to fund all the projects. Like I said, it's a wish list of projects. Well, one of the things public-private partnership does is it looks at those potential projects, and now you can apply private financing for some of the projects and take that public capital that might be in short supply and direct it to projects that would otherwise not be funded. In other words, PPPs can turbocharge a project. So if it doesn't seem to be suitable as a public-private partnership, well, then it should be financed through traditional public financial means. Like I said, it doesn't mean it's a bad project, and the need might be so genuine that you should move forward with anyways. If it can be done as a public-private partnership, this is what's going to launch us into a deeper feasibility study of the project and preparing it for actual procurement. So this is the actual spreadsheet. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through every tab, every line. But if you look at the bottom, I know it's tough to see from the back, but we have strategy, technical, complexity, legal, environmental, social, economic, financial, private sector interests down here. And the tool is relatively straightforward. And what it does, it essentially just asks a series of questions. So for instance, this is the technical tab, technical feasibility. You can see this is not a very deep analysis at all. It's just pre-feasibility. So one of the very first questions that's asked is there a study indicating that the project is technically feasible? A lot of times in your national planning documents or capital budgeting documents, to actually get placed into the capital budget, there's already been some preliminary work done. And very simply, the answer is going to be yes, no, it is currently under study, or it's not applicable. And you just pick one. And so if it's yes, this goes from 0 to 1. It's just a 0 to 1 score. And it's almost a checklist, and you just go through each of these tabs. This is something that we've used in working with the World Bank, and I'm going to show you a project we actually worked on, and we did use this tool. So it's very self-explanatory, very straightforward. Interestingly enough, also under the technical feasibility question, are projects with similar technology currently operating in the country? These are just very simple questions. And just kind of, like I said, it's not something you have to spend 6 months going through each question. Sometimes you could have a fuel shortage on the island when there's heavy demand. Zanzibar is very reliant on receiving fuel through a port. It doesn't generate, There's no drilling on the island. There's no refinery on the island, so it relies on imports of fuel. There's a fuel port, sometimes referred to as a bulk liquids terminal, at Matone, right up here, Matone. So it's probably more than 50 years old by now. It's too small to meet the needs of the island. Another difficulty is the draft, that is the depth of the water at the port, is too shallow to allow large fuel tankers to come in. So it becomes a problem. So it requires a lot of shipments in smaller ships, which is problematic because it's extra transactions, extra movements of ships, which is costly. It also, because of all the hookups and the frequent hookups, there's increased likelihood of spills, which is environmentally bad, obviously. And the actual storage facilities are relatively small. Just picture an aerial shot of the facility. These are the fuel operating companies. Wherever you see kind of these tanks, there's 4 of them. Up here, there used to be a 5th up here, no longer in existence. If you know Zanzibar, Stone Town is down about right here. Okay, so this is to the north of Stone Town. This road right here is one of the main roads to the north, correct? Right? Up there, this area is somewhat residential over here. This is where a resort's being built, so there's dredging taking place. This is probably tough to see. This is one of the driveways leading to one of the fuel oil companies. Not very safe. You come out onto a narrow road that's heavily traveled. Fuel can be a dangerous business. It's flammable. So this is, ripe for an accident. There's a ship at berth. There's pipes that lead out. The ships, this is about as close as they come in. They hook up. The fuel's offloaded. This is actually a water pipe that's leaking that is heading out to the island out there. This is a presentation, by the way, that we made to the regulatory authority as well as the PPP unit and planning in Zanzibar. So there's a need. They're looking for energy security, meaning that they have sufficient fuel. They want the fuel costs to be lower. And the existing facility, the Matone facility, is in a very desirable location to be developed for a higher and better use than it's currently being used for. The current facility is down around here. We looked at different options of where the new facility could go. Turns out Bumbwini to the north, you'll see in a moment, it's what we would call a greenfield site. Greenfield meaning a brand new facility. Is what brownfield means, an existing facility. The site has good access. These are some things not necessarily important to our discussion today, but we wanted to understand there were planning authority permits adjacent to it. Is there adequate supporting infrastructure? By the way, which is one of the things you would examine in pre-feasibility. That's one of the things we're examining. So it's one thing, let's say you want a new bridge, and you're going to have it built as a public-private partnership. Well, do you have adequate roads leading up to the bridge? If you want a new water filtration plant, that's all great, but do you have an adequate piping network to distribute the water? That's supporting infrastructure. We remember one of the things we were wondering about in terms of suitability as a public-private partnership, is there enough market interest in the project? In this case, this port facility, there is. There have actually been a number of unsolicited proposals. They were more ideas than actual fully executed proposals. But certainly other parties, private parties, they've identified this need for Zanzibar, and they've come up with what they think are solutions. This is another type of dashboard. So when we were looking at different options for locations, there were 2 Bumbwini options. You can see there's 4 more down here. So there's different ways of doing these pre-feasibility studies. One of the ways to do them is what they call the case method, where it's basically the 5 case method. So you look at the strategic case, the economic case, commercial, financial, and management. We did this a couple different ways. We did do it this way. You'll see in the next presentation in a moment, under the Zanzibar law, they specify what's required for pre-feasibility. So you always want to comply with the law. So did it that way as well. So what's interesting about this is not the results, but this was a presentation on what would be studied. So in the strategic case, you start asking the questions of what must the project do? One of the things as it relates to the fuel port, if we're going to have a new fuel port, there's also in Zanzibar, in Stonetown, there's a container port. And there's the government's identified a need to relocate the container port, and would this project complicate that? We want to firmly establish the necessity of the project, the need, who needs to be consulted. This is all part of putting the strategic case together. How would this improve life in Zanzibar? And what could go wrong? What are the risks? So those are things that the strategic case would take a look at. The economic case is, here's our options analysis. Are there alternatives? And turns out there are different things that can be done. There's actually, as we discussed earlier, there's a non-asset alternative. A new port is a new asset alternative. An existing asset alternative would be to, if you will, maybe dredge the existing port to make the draft deeper and maybe improve the facilities. The existing facilities need better fire protection, things of that nature. But there's also a non-asset solution. The non-asset solution would be in the fuel industry, there's what's known as fuel tickets. It's essentially options. So currently, Zanzibar receives its fuel primarily through from Mombasa and Kenya, as well as Dar es Salaam. The fuel comes out of there as well. Well, instead, if Zanzibar kind of looks like it's going to be short on fuel, they have what are essentially fuel tickets, which are options on fuel, on call. Zanzibar, actually the regulatory authority, ZER, would exercise those tickets, those options, and fuel would be delivered. It can be expensive, and it's not foolproof. So those are alternatives that were looked at. Are the existing facilities driving the costs and shortages, or is there something else? Is the facility fine, but is the regulatory environment, are price controls, fuel prices are controlled in Zanzibar, are they problematic? Is there going to be a benefit? It's part of economic cost benefit analysis. Are the stakeholders going to benefit? And you want to look at economic conditions, essentially macroeconomic conditions, things such as inflation, for instance, exchange rates, currency risk. Then there's the commercial case, which kind of asks, like, what do you want the project to do? Who's going to bear the risk of the project? Commercially, if somebody's going to make an investment in this as a public-private partnership, how are they going to be paid? Is it an availability payment? Is it a user fee payment? If it's a user fee payment, what form does that take? If it's an availability payment, what are the key performance indicators? Is the investor paying taxes? And what taxes are they paying? Or are they going to be exempt from taxes? Sometimes that happens. And also, again, looking at sustainability. Financially, CapEx and OpEx. Anybody want to tell me what CapEx means, OpEx means, if you've run across those phrases before? What do you think? Anybody want to take a guess what CapEx means? Yeah, capital expenses. OpEx is operating expenses, right? How much revenue is the project going to generate? This is basically starting to put together a financial model for the project. Remember yesterday we talked about, in terms of guiding principles in public-private partnerships, balancing affordability and bankability. Well, is the project bankable? Is the government going to need to subsidize the project? It needs to be studied. If it does, or if there are any guarantees provided, is there going to be a fiscal impact on the government? Meaning, is it going to somehow negatively impact the government's budget? Will prices come down for the consumers, the drivers, the vehicle drivers? Is there financing available for the project? Are we at the right location? When we did the pre-feasibility work, which is what this is, we did not have a study in existence for a bulk liquids terminal. What we had was, there had been a study for the relocation of the container port. And the container port study kind of showed Bumbwini as being ideal. We still had to ask the question, okay, that might be really good for a container port, but does it make sense for a fuel port? Two different things. It looked like it did, by the way. So, and then, remember, one of the things we come to is, once we make a decision whether or not we're going to pursue this further to move to the feasibility phase, we then had a way forward and things that had to be done. And so we essentially created a quick chart. At this point, we were just outlining what had to be done for a 5-case pre-feasibility study, and this is the report writing. We still had to do all that work. So that was looking at the 5-case method, but then to comply with Zanzibar law, we had a second study. So in the presentation, we said, there's things we want to know. Are we going to get value for money? Is it viable from a technical standpoint? Commercially viable, meaning financially viable. And is it acceptable? This is our affordability, bankability, acceptability, manageability. So under the law in Zanzibar, it's quite specific in terms of what a pre-feasibility requirement, what a pre-feasibility study requires. So I think there's, I forget how many, 10. There's 10 items: needs analysis, the description of the project, sectoral analysis, the PPP analysis, what type of contracts being suggested, how it would be implemented, cost, a pretty basic financial model, an assessment of risk, and an assessment of any government financial support for the project. In terms of the advantages of the project, certainly if you have energy security, lower fuel costs, that should generate economic growth, better capacity, efficiency, and security. The existing facility can be regenerated to serve a better purpose than it's currently being used for. What are some of the disadvantages? Well, Zanzibar has never done a public-private partnership, so this would be a first. So when you first try to do something, it can be difficult, so it's pioneering. The transaction costs could be costly. We still did not have information on how large a project it would be, and in terms of output, what it would be. There was a technical question. You don't have to be a maritime expert, but this is a jetty. So it could be what they call use a jetty, or in the existing port, they use a mooring system. The ship pulls up to essentially a buoy, moors to the buoy, and from there, the oil is pumped out. Interestingly enough, one of the things in our discovery process we learned is that the new facility could be more than simply a tanking facility for fuel. A lot of island nations, Mauritius, for instance, they require different grades of fuel. It could be a mixing facility and transshipment point for other island nations. There were other things that could be done with the fuel on the site. So if there was a new port, new ZLT, is it going to line up with the priorities? This is the sectoral analysis. So there's Vision 2020. Remember we talked about planning documents for Zanzibar. This is right in line with what their planning document has. Also, the Zanzibar Strategy for Growth and Reduction of Poverty specifically notes that they want to expand storage capacity for strategic fuel reserve. That's what this would do. And actually, the follow-up to this first strategic document was another document, and it encouraged FDI, which is foreign direct investment. Public-private partnerships are great sources for foreign direct investment because a lot of times it comes from overseas. And it would encourage PPPs, which is what that document proposed. We had to look at the socioeconomic benefits. We did, again, a kind of a quick dashboard. Green is good, red is bad. And looking at the benefits, foreign direct investment, activity, job creation, freeing up capital of the revolutionary government for other projects it may have. You can just kind of, I'm not going to go through each one. Safety is a big issue. Importantly, as you know, Stonetown is a UNESCO heritage site, fairly significant. The existing fuel port negatively impacts that. By the way, so this, when we have traditional PPP, that's just looking at the different forms of delivering the project. So, for instance, relocating the project to Bumbwini, even if it's done through traditional public finance means, is actually good for Stonetown, so that's green. In terms of foreign direct investment, a traditional procurement is not good because the government's going to pay for it. It's not attracting any investment, whereas a public-private partnership would. So we had a proposed form of contract. We thought this really made sense as a really full public-private partnership where we would like the private partner to design it, build it, finance it, operate and maintain it. Right? They would do all those things. And the market, by the way, what we heard from, at least witnessed with unsolicited proposals, they all had the capacity to do that. Had to come up with an implementation plan that we essentially kind of said, okay, these are kind of things that we're going to need to do. Again, some of this probably looks forward to you. So spend maybe up to 4 months on the identification and screening of the project, which we actually did within that time frame. Building the business case is essentially the feasibility work that still is not completed. We took an initial crack at allocating risk for the project. Government would take on these risks, private would take on these risks. So output specifications. That is, remember, we're focused in public-private partnership. The government's not designing the project, but they are saying what they want it to do. Well, the government's going to, if the government's going to do that, they're actually assuming that risk. So for instance, if the government, in terms of output specification, might want to say, may say that the project, the new port facility needs to handle, pick a number in terms of liters of fuel or tons of fuel. Well, If they specify it too low and it's not sufficient to meet the needs of the island, but the private partner builds it to those output specifications, well, it's actually the government's risk if it needs to be expanded, because they specified that. The design, though, of it, private party is going to assume that. Same with they're taking the financial, construction, operations risk. Risk is not always allocated to simply one party. Sometimes it's shared. In terms of the government having to support the project financially, what we saw here is, that we didn't think there was going to be any need for a demand guarantee. That is, the government promising the private party that there will be enough demand for the fuel. Right now, there's more than enough demand. There's enough demand that there's a shortage. Does not look like the government's going to have to subsidize the project. The government would likely need to contribute the land to the project, and there might be some tax incentives. Frankly, as a matter of law, the private party could access them. So does the ZLT generate value for money? And the Zanzibar PPP Act has a definition for value for money, and we believe it does. So again, just another little dashboard on how the project's delivered, whether the government delivers it or if it's done through a public-private partnership. We believe that the PPP option is the best. And that's it. So that's an actual project. Subsequently, in additional due diligence, there is an issue. We have concerns at the site that we selected that there's a coral reef out there, and there's a question on what the impacts might be on the coral reef. So there's still things that need to be resolved. But this is an actual real project being addressed and being looked at and examined. I think there's a question over here. Let us get the microphone.
Thank you. In the feasibility study, among of the other elements of which you talked about the financial case whereby the strategic location and whether the project will be bankable was among of the important variables or elements to be considered. And when we are talking about the location, we are talking about land.
When we're talking about location? Yeah.
Directly we are talking about land because the project has to be located on land. And when we are talking about the bankability, we are talking about the value of land of which can be used as a guarantee to get loan from the bank. Now, I'm asking myself, the PPP engagement or project takes about 15 or 20 years. Why can't the land be used as among of the variables of which the partner can consider and hence reducing the time span for the PPP project?
Right, so the land is controlled by the government. The government controls it. The government would essentially, when I say contribute the land to the project, the government was prepared to essentially rent-free allow the private partner to use the land. The land would not be able to secure the loan necessarily because the government doesn't want to sell the land, so you don't want the bank taking over the land necessarily, okay? If the government contributes the land, it does lower the cost of the project, which is certainly good, but in terms of the investment that would need to be made in the facility, you'd have to build all those tanks, you'd have to build pumping stations, you have to build jetties. It's going to be quite expensive, tens of millions of dollars. I think we figured out it would be around $50 million US. And you're going to need sufficient time, 20 years or more, to earn that investment back. So you do need a fairly lengthy period of time. And the government was prepared to do that, to grant that. The government wasn't so much focused on, they were prepared to allow the private operator to earn a reasonable rate of return on their investment. But the government's primary focus was meeting the fuel needs of the island. And if this is the best solution, they're ready to do that. The land consideration, just was one component of that.
Maybe I have not well understood my question. I'm not saying that the land is used by the bank as a guarantee to issue the loan.
Okay.
But I'm considering during the negotiation between the two partners, that the investor and the government, why can't it be considered as an important element as you have told us that...
the land is considered an important element.
Yes.
But the government's not necessarily looking to make a return off the land. The government's primary focus is having the land put to good use to meet the energy needs of the island. So, and by the way, because the government owns the Matoni, where the existing port is, that can be subsequently developed commercially for other uses. So the government would get a benefit from that land. So it would benefit both with the new facility as well as with the existing facility. The land where it is now is simply being farmed, and it's low impact farming. There's not a lot of value being generated from it.
Sorry, don't you think that maybe there is an important need of training on the negotiation skills? Because when you are negotiating as a government and the partner, that is business. Though the government is supposed to deliver services to the citizens or residents. But during the process, the investor is making business. On the other hand, it could have used it as an important element for the negotiation and hence reduce the number of years.
Oh yeah, now it can be. I just don't think in this case it would make sense to do that. It's not, I wouldn't hold up the deal over the rents on the land or negotiating that. I mean, the government, I think, if the government ends up moving forward with the project, the government will need to have outside transaction advisors to assist in the negotiation with whomever the private party is, to work out the best deal in terms of generating sufficient returns both for the private party, but in terms that are acceptable for the government as well. Having examined the principles we use to identify and screen projects for their public-private partnership potential, let's now take a look at some actual case studies. My colleague, Ned White, will take you through some examples and some studies that have been done of actual projects.
I did mention, I want to pick up a little bit and return to our case example from South Africa yesterday. South Africa provides an interesting case in that they set up a framework and support specifically for local governments, understanding that a lot of the needs for infrastructure development in sectors like water distribution, waste management and collection, transportation, local transportation, affordable housing, these are all responsibilities of local governments. So how do you support local governments who often have, we'll say, less capacity and even less funding to prepare and implement PPP projects? But we saw yesterday that a couple of things that are interesting, I think, and instructive about this case is that it said basically local governments are the ones who have the needs to review PPP projects and limited capacity and limited funding. But they are the ones who will identify and select their own projects. So we say that this was a demand-driven approach. Nobody was telling local governments, here's a project that you need to do as a PPP. It was up to them to decide if they wanted to or not. The other part is that the advice provided by the MIIU Secretariat was free. They didn't have to pay for it. That was sponsored by donors. The fund, called a PDF, Project Development Fund, sometimes called a Project Preparation Fund. It pays for the costs, as the name implies, of the preparation and analysis of PPPs. This is a grant fund, so it didn't need to be, initially, it didn't need to be repaid. They weren't trying to recover these costs. And the role here then was to stimulate the overall objective of this project when we designed it was to create a new marketplace in South Africa of local governments who now know about some PPPs and have done PPPs, and even local advisors. The firms who do the feasibility studies and the transaction advisory work, those are local firms. So that after about 5 years was the initial plan, this project could essentially close up. It had stimulated and created now a sustainable market. It ended up actually being so successful that they did a second capital call, meaning they said, let's put more money into this, let's extend its life, which they did. It ended up living for about 8 or more years. And then this function was actually transferred over within government to the national PPP unit. But the whole purpose here was to stimulate a market. The other thing I want to mention is that they decided to keep this independent. They said rather than have it be within government or maybe under the control of one political set of interests or another, keep it all independent. So the decisions are made based on the strengths of the projects themselves, not based on any other considerations. So that was demand-driven, as I'd mentioned. They applied it across many different sectors and employed many different PPP techniques. And here is a look at their initial track record. They did more projects than this, but initially you'll see that they were doing things in the water and sanitation sector, parking, waste landfills, a number in the water and sanitation distribution sectors. They did it in the ICT sector, fleet maintenance. Even there were local governments who owned airports. They had some assets. Now, should a local government own an airport? Is that really essential to its services? Do they manage it well? In this case, they were able to concession some of those out. And for the limited amount of money, you'll see that at this time, this was nearly $1 billion of contract value in this case. But it shows the other PPP projects at national level as well that were done in South Africa under this framework. They've done a number of hospitals. They've done some IT systems. Here's one for the department, a new IT system for the Department of Labor. Some road projects, let's see, a number of what we call accommodation sector projects. An accommodation PPP would refer to a PPP where the private partner is providing the building and maintaining it and the equipment. They're not actually occupying the building or delivering the service, but they're providing the infrastructure. So you see accommodation PPPs used for schools, like John mentioned. In those cases, you'd say that the students come from the public education system, the teachers, the curriculum, the administrators. Here you'll see others that are done in fleet management, again, hospitals, and the transport sector. One of the comments raised by those in the PPP unit who designed and really managed this whole process, they said that they were a little disappointed that when they created the whole framework, the model documents and the guidelines and all of this, they were hoping that line ministries would come forward with many more PPP projects. What they found generally was that the first group of PPP projects identified were generally for non-core services. In other words, if it's the, I'll take it in this case, the Department of Trade and Industry or other sectors, instead of saying that, well, actually we want to take some of the core services that we provide or electricity generation in the power sector. Instead, they didn't pick those projects. They picked things like fleet maintenance or IT support or office buildings, things like that. So anyway, you'll see a number of different lessons learned from these experiences, and you can look that they did projects at not only the national level, but provincial level governments as well. So interesting thing again about the South African PPP framework is that they really designed something to meet their own needs. They included things like key public sector priorities into the PPP program, like the South Africa's entire Black Economic Empowerment Program. That's very much built into the overall PPP framework. And the other thing that they tried to do, I think, very carefully in South Africa is to make the whole process as transparent as possible. They invested a lot in making sure that the public consultation process and stakeholder management was really done as a priority. I think reflecting the fact that in the past it had been that there was no communication or consultation. So another country with some experience and lessons to be learned from their experience in project identification and selection is Kenya. Kenya created a framework. Again, it's very similar. A lot of support and help from donors, such as the World Bank in funding the framework development and even some of the early project preparation. But here you'll see the components of this, including a PPP Act from 2013, PPP regulations. They also have a PPP toolkit and a guidelines manual. Here you'll see within the National Treasury where the PPP unit is located, and basically its initial staffing plan. Again, you'll see that there was support from donors providing credit for capacity building and framework development in Kenya. Another part that we'll talk about here is the concern about the liabilities, the public sector liabilities in PPPs. Now, usually in a PPP, who borrows the funds to build the project? Who provides the financing for PPPs, usually? Private sector, okay. Do PPPs create financial liabilities for governments? What do you think? It depends. Sure. How could a PPP create a financial liability for government? What kinds of PPPs might actually create financial liabilities for governments?
If the agreement of the project that we're having the contract, maybe to deliver a certain project, and then it happened there are delays in the project implementation. Because those private sector, they've already secured the funds from the banks. Then if the government, it delays on the issue of permission and issuing the license and what, then the delayed could be gone to the government.
Sure, it could impose costs on government, sure. The usual way that PPPs can create financial liabilities is when we think about PPPs that have availability payments. Essentially, the government is saying, if you make the services available, the facility and the services available for 20 years, we will pay you this amount. That is a future liability, right? You're signing a contract. So an important thing in overall PPP frameworks is you have to have a clear, transparent way of identifying, measuring, and monitoring these future liabilities to make sure you can afford them. The danger is, and this is oftentimes the concern of ministries of finance, as we said, contracting authorities can go out today, sign PPP contracts, and we only find out later on that, well, actually we now have to make these payments or accept these liabilities, which maybe we cannot afford. So an important part of any PPP framework is, we call it the Fiscal Commitment and Contingent Liability Framework. Make sure for any PPP contract you sign, at least you are aware of all the potential future financial liabilities to the state. Okay, here is a look at some of the early projects identified initially, the pipeline of projects identified in Kenya. And you'll see they come across it from a range of sectors, including roads and transport. Actually, they're doing a large number of road PPPs. They're doing this on an availability payment basis. Another word for that is annuity payment. Essentially, they're telling a private partner, here's an existing road, heavily traveled. We want you to expand it and widen it, add new lanes for 100 kilometers and more, and maintain it Key output standards are things like the pavement condition and the roughness of the road, but you have to meet all the maintenance standards, and we will pay you for 10 years, a 10-year annuity payment. A key part of PPPs, we talked a little bit about this, is you have to make sure that your private partner sticks with the project. In order to get all the money that they need to earn their return, they've got to stick with the project for its entire life. You don't want to have a case where you pay a private partner, say, 80% of the funds after they build it, and then a little bit of money for maintaining it. Oftentimes the problem with that is they'll say, well, I've made my 80% and there's really not much money to be made in ongoing maintenance, so I won't manage that risk as well. Instead, you want to make sure that they stick with the project. So these annuity payments, annuity meaning annual payments, spread out so that they go all the way to the end of the life of the contract. You'll also see it in the energy sector, power sector. Again, the independent power project model is probably one of the most commonly applied models in PPPs. In the healthcare sector, even in, we'll see in this case, accommodation, especially for students. We'll look at a case here that I've highlighted in yellow, which is the student hostels PPP. We'll talk about that case. And you'll see it in other sectors as well. So one of the things you'll see is they've applied it across a range of sectors, not just one.
Okay, here.
Yeah.
So my point is on the fiscal of the development of the fiscal commitment and the condition of the reliability framework.
Yes.
So I want to know back to the PPP point of views that sometime I want to know if possible the government can issue the guarantee to the investors due to the changes of the market price, because sometimes, let's look at examples. Maybe the investors invest to the countries, but they fear changes of the market may read the problem on the futures.
Sure.
But so maybe they can ask the government to issue the guarantee so as to ensure the sustainability of the project. So is it possible maybe the government to issue guarantee on the PPP project to ensure the sustainability of the project?
You're right. Very often investors will ask for, and especially lenders, almost as many guarantees as they can get. In fact, don't be surprised, I've seen in PPPs that even on the eve of financial closure, they will ask for a full sovereign guarantee. They'll say, you know, we could finance this project tomorrow if you just give a full sovereign guarantee that the government will repay as it is a sovereign guaranteed loan. You don't want that, because then the private partner's capital is not at risk. But you will find in practice, we'll talk about this more tomorrow, you have to identify all risks in a project. That's one process. You need to analyze their impact. Do they affect the project greatly or moderately or maybe not at all? You have to look at the probability. These are some subjective measures. How likely is it that a risk event will occur? A construction cost overrun, maybe a delay in the acquisition of land. But then you have to allocate every single risk very carefully to each party. So this is why PPPs take longer, as John mentioned, take more time and money to prepare up front, because we've got to identify, analyze, and then allocate all of these risks up front. Normally, under publicly financed projects, we assume all risks are borne by the public sector. When we make that assumption, we don't really have to identify all the risks as carefully, nor analyze them. And most importantly, we don't really manage those risks very well. When everything's done in the public sector, governments don't often do a very good job of managing these risks. Some of these risks, when you transfer them to a private partner, they say you're responsible for managing the risk, meaning if you don't manage it, you will bear the cost of that. That's what gets the private partner to manage those risks better. So in looking at all of these risks, any risk that is borne in or shared by the public sector, maybe the government says, we'll guarantee you a minimum level of revenue so you can at least cover your fixed costs of operation. That might be a form of a guarantee. That translates into a financial liability for government, right? It's a difficult one to analyze because you don't know if you're going to be paying out or not based on, say, market levels of demand or revenue. But you have to keep that, include that in this fiscal commitment and contingent liability framework. Okay, so in Kenya, again, you'll see it was done across a number of different sectors. Here is a look at candidate projects they identified for the Ministry of Transport and Infrastructure. You'll see about 17 of those initially. The energy and petroleum sector, a number of projects, water, environment and natural resources, education, science and technology projects identified, as well as others. So overall, at least initially at one point, they've had a potential pipeline of 70 projects. Now here's a question. If you were managing the PPP unit in this country and you had a portfolio, you've got 70 potential projects that you've got to be keeping track of, monitoring consultants, seeing their progress, working with line ministries and contracting authorities. Does that seem feasible to you? If you were the head of the PPP unit? 70 at once? You'd have to have a pretty big team and you'd have to be pretty well set up. But here, again, I've said that oftentimes the key constraint that countries face is they don't have yet a pipeline of candidate projects to implement. So we have to identify some and prepare them. You want to make sure, though, you don't spread yourself too thin. It can be quite a task to oversee 70 projects at once with differing levels of progress. Okay, one of the projects, one of the early ones that actually did reach what we'll call commercial closure, meaning they signed a contract with the private investor. They have not yet reached financial closure. Financial closure means that the private investor has sourced and provided all the financing so they can begin construction. John mentioned that these projects get financed with combinations of debt and equity. One of the things that's characteristic of most infrastructure projects is they're financed with a lot more debt than they are equity. We call that financial leverage. These are big, capital-intensive projects. They're supposed to last a long period of time. We don't expect that a private firm will have all of the equity in its own account to just fund it as an equity investment. We expect that they're going to put in some equity, and they're then going to get lenders to lend to their PPP project. So when we say that a project must be bankable, what we're thinking about is how do you make it so that it is attractive and bankable enough, if you will, that lenders will lend to it. That is an additional process. So here we see one of them is Kenyatta University. And this is a model that a number of countries, universities even in Tanzania and elsewhere, I've seen it in Malawi, seen it actually succeed in Namibia, Zambia as well, is student hostels. Here's a question for you. Under a student hostel PPP, where would the revenue stream come from?
The source of revenue should be from the fees from the students.
You would like it to
Hostel
come
fees.
from the students. You'd say,
Yes.
we'll just have a pass-through. Maybe we collect them, but that's the source of revenue.
Sure.
And in fact, most universities would say, let's do this as a pure concession. We'll provide the land. We'll say the students are here, but you work it out yourselves. The students pay you. You take the demand risk. In a student hostel, if you were an investor in a university student hostel, what risks might you be the most concerned about? How many residents or occupants do you think you're going to have?
Not necessarily you know the
Yes.
number of students which will be enrolled in a specific year. So your risk can be a demand
Exactly.
market
Exactly.
risk, yeah.
Now, on the positive side, you could say demand risk. We're facing a shortage here. You could look at it, I mean, you look at in Kenya, they were saying, like many universities, strong growth in the number of students, right? each year. Huge shortage. In Kenyatta University, they were saying that the university itself provides housing for only 54%. Where are the rest of them going? They're going in the local market. They're probably staying, I don't know, as we say, overcrowded, right? Probably not safe. Number of concerns. Families, parents have real concerns, especially about those issues. So there's a huge pent-up level of demand, right? You could say, boy, if you build it, they'll come. But what risks might you face if you're a private developer? You have no guarantee from the university. What could happen to that level of demand? What if the university closes? What if they say, no classes for this semester? Right? Or there's many other risks. So you need to think about all these things very carefully. In the case of Kenyatta University, a big issue is the university itself wanted to say, we don't want to accept the financial liability ourselves. We might end up in a case where what if the revenues that we receive, the fees from students are here, and yet our availability payments to the private partner are here, and now we're facing a shortfall. The private developer wants to say, look, the risks I can control, I can design it and build it and maintain it. But I can't take the risks of how many students are. I'm attracted to the market. I think it's likely that I'll get full occupancy, but I can't take the risks of these other things. Or what if there are, I don't know, what if there are students who vandalize the property there? Who takes care of those issues? What if you have a student who is occupying the space but isn't paying? Who wants to take on the responsibility of, I don't know, you'd say, relocating them or collecting from them? Very important issues, all of which need to be thought out quite carefully. So we see here, at least in this case, in Kenyatta University, they reached commercial closure. That was back a couple of years ago. So they've signed a contract with the investor, but they are still waiting for financial closure. Again, because lenders, keep this in mind, when lenders lend to the PPP, they're really looking almost only to the revenues of that project for repayment. They don't get a sovereign guarantee, right? So if the project fails, they don't get paid. They also don't have typically what we call a corporate guarantee. They can't say, well, if the developer hasn't paid me, I can go and take these other assets that are pledged as collateral. We say their only recourse is to the project itself. That's why lenders do such a detailed due diligence and insist on that all risks be identified and that they be carefully allocated so that even issues like what if you have a student who's occupying this and not paying, or there's student vandalism, or all these detailed issues. Or what if the university decides, I don't know, the government decides to close the university because of, for whatever reason. Okay. Now, next, move into a case that we'll pursue in a little more detail here, and this is in the island of Mauritius. So here you'll see Mauritius in the southern Indian Ocean here. Here's how you'll see at least it compares generally with Tanzania. Small population in an island. Moderate, I would say even a middle income level in terms of the economy. One of the things that it has invested in heavily is it used to be primarily its major exports were sugar. So it had a thriving sugarcane industry. It has since done a lot in terms of light manufacturing and transshipment and tourism. The other part that's really beautiful about this is you got this in the capital city there of Port Louis. I've seen more rainbows there in one day than I've ever seen anywhere else in the world. The rain clouds come over the mountains, then they start to rain. When you get the sun behind it, you see a rainbow about every 10 minutes. It's remarkable. Okay, we were asked in Mauritius under a World Bank project to do two things. Number one, can you help us develop a PPP framework? They had already had a PPP law, but not really many deals done. And they said, can you help us strengthen our PPP framework, so legally and institutionally? And then secondly, can you help us identify a pipeline of our first 10 candidate projects and do pre-feasibility studies on them? Let's get the pipeline started. So, said, yes, we can do that. You have to come up with selection criteria. Was actually given the public sector investment program. This was a list of all approved public sector investments done by a multi-ministerial body that had reviewed and said, yes, here are the projects in each sector that we approve as needed projects. So we came up with criteria. They should be familiar to you from what John had covered. Criteria including number one, let's review the projects and see, number one, it should be a government priority. Any project that we do as a PPP project, make sure it meets the needs of saying this really is a public sector priority. So does it appear in the public sector investment program, or in reviewing it, could we say, yes, there clearly is a public sector need for this project? So to quote John, no more bridges to nowhere, or projects that maybe only have one political supporter for them. Secondly, the government said we only want to look at candidate projects that don't already have identified sources of financing. This was a difficult issue, because when I look at PPP projects, I tend to say which projects are needed and when can PPPs provide better value for money. The challenge oftentimes is that when there are projects in the port sector, let's say, or other sectors where you'd say, an investment here will generate new revenue. You tend to get donors and others that will say, we'll fund this project because it's going to generate new revenue. We don't need to do PPPs. And I would say that's not how you make the PPP decision. PPP decision should be based on how you get the best value for money, not what are the leftover projects that donors aren't funding. Number three, let's have indications that it is affordable for end user fees. The government was also very interested in saying, we don't want to do PPPs based on availability payments. Our public sector budgets for contracting authorities and line ministries, we think that they're mostly full. No more fiscal space. We only want to do PPPs that are based on a user fee model or a concession model. Again, this is a practical issue dealing with stakeholders where I said, yes, but you're really limiting the scope of PPPs. You should look at PPPs when they can provide better value for money, not based on can we get end users to pay for it instead of the government to pay for it. So you can tell that in the practical world, the advice of advisors doesn't always meet that of what the clients want to do. These are real world issues. We said, try and pick projects that would tend to be easy to implement, meaning not projects that are too large, too complex, that don't have controversial stakeholder issues or environmental issues. We said, do ones that would likely be attractive to the private sector, meaning where you could say, well, we've seen PPPs done for these types of projects elsewhere. We know that there generally is market interest in this, or in precedents. We said also try and do ones that would be replicable, meaning that let's say you take what would be an example? You might take a project like a wind farm project. You say, boy, Mauritius, from where it sits, actually has a pretty strong and constant source of wind energy. And we say, well, if you can structure one of those, then you could actually repeat this maybe several more times in the country. So, and then we also said, try and diversify across a range of sectors, meaning don't only do wind energy projects as your first 10 pipelines, but try and diversify across sectors. So here is what we did. We took this about 300 projects. We narrowed it down to what we called a long list of 20 candidate projects. And then working with key stakeholders, we said, we want you to score these 20 projects on the following criteria. And because our information and our data on these projects is very limited, we said, let's not make these scoring criteria too complex. In other words, when we say, Here is criteria 1 in this column. Is it a public sector priority? We said address it, answer the question as yes, high, medium, or low. I have seen some consultants who maybe think they're smarter than they really are, who will say, I know, we'll come up with a quantitative methodology and we'll score each of these on a scale of 1 to 50, and each one will be scored according to this framework, and we'll quantify the results and we'll measure it and we'll compare it. And then I say, okay, but what's the difference between a score of, say, 38 and 37? How do you decide? You've only got maybe 2 pages of conceptual description of a project. How do you do that? So one of the lessons learned when you're selecting projects, don't make it too complicated or more detailed than the source of information you have on projects. Big challenge we often find at this stage in PPPs is we have very limited information on a project. Maybe no technical study, maybe only a concept description, like 2 pages. This project would provide energy, but you don't know how big it is or how much it would cost, or that's what the feasibility study is for. So we have the other criteria here that we've also reviewed. Is it likely to be affordable? Is it likely to provide better value for money? And we scored them. You'll see at least the sectors here are things like in the port sector, expanding the container terminal, the port in Port Louis. Another one is for a cruise ship terminal. We see there were some projects in the local fisheries sector, solid waste management, wastewater treatment, accommodation. We see others in the water sector, some in the road development sector, and we even considered 2 unsolicited proposals that hadn't been identified, that weren't in the public sector investment program. But we said they're still public priorities, and they could provide better value for money. So we came up then with the short list. And here's the short list of the 10 projects that we said, yes, let's do pre-feasibility studies on them. And you'll see they're in sectors like a marketplace or an auction market for fish. We see the one in red is what we're going to be focusing on next, which is a hazardous waste treatment facility. And you'll see other sectors here, including ones for wind energy, as well as a wind farm, as well as even a road project, which was an unsolicited proposal. There was a private landowner who owned land that would be ideal for a connection road, would relieve congestion between 2 points. We said, okay, let's at least evaluate this, but you can only negotiate with the current landowner. So that's what made it an unsolicited proposal. Okay, let's look at the candidate project here in red, which is the hazardous waste treatment facility. Prior to this project, Mauritius did not have a hazardous waste treatment facility or capability. In other words, the wastes from industries, which are oftentimes hazardous, they're not household wastes that will just decompose, but these are industrial wastes, agricultural wastes, other wastes that have important toxic side effects. They were simply being treated with normal waste. So this is a brand new project. Here is an outline of the pre-feasibility study. Basically said, number 1, tell us in about a page or 2 the concept. What is the project for? What service would it provide? Sort of what's the rationale? What do you think, how would you describe the rationale for this project? The first hazardous waste treatment facility in the country. Why should you have one?
Polluter pay principle.
There you go. Can you say that again?
Yes, the polluter pays. The
Polluter
more you
pays
pollute, the
principle.
more you pay. Because the industrial owners, for instance, if there is the area where they can dispose those wastes, which means even their business might be not as much as they can as compared to where there is a safe system of disposing those wastes. So to their side, they might think of the establishment of the disposal site. It might generate more profit, and they might be in a position to pay much.
Okay.
So that to make more business. But on the on the question of environment, then we can apply the polluter pays principle. The more you pollute, the more you pay.
Okay, very interesting. And here's where we get into an interesting policy decision of we need a new service. It's going to have environmental benefits for all. Now, who should pay for it? And there are some that will say, let's take household wastes. Sometimes we say, well, if we were to charge the full price of household waste collection to each individual household, many of them will probably say, I can't afford it. And then what would they do with their garbage or their refuse? How much waste there is determines how big of a facility we build. And also, here's an issue, if waste is not being tracked or licensed and monitored right now, maybe we don't know. We're going to actually have to go out and find and measure from industries how much wastes of this type and this type and this type are you generating. All right, other things that go into the pre-feasibility study, summarize the available information about the project. Maybe there is a demand study that was done or some survey. Maybe it's old and needs to be updated. Do we have some initial cost projections? Sometimes a technical study has been done. We also have here as a PPP, what are the indications that it's affordable? Is this going to be a big issue or a moderate issue? And how should we address it? Well, you need to address it by doing a survey of the industries and find out about how much would it increase their costs of business. We talk about stakeholder management being difficult in PPPs. Who is a stakeholder, an important stakeholder, who might not be in favor of this project? Who's a stakeholder who you think might not really want to see this project proceed? So are industries going to willingly pay more money to bring their wastes to be treated at a new hazardous waste treatment facility? Are they going to do that willingly? You have to make sure there's a law. Sure, so part of this that goes into the feasibility and study and pre-feasibility study, what are the existing laws? Is the law that requires that in place? Usually you see that this is done through a licensing process. It says, okay, you're licensed, you're allowed to generate this waste, but you have to demonstrate and report how much was produced, how it was disposed of, has to be audited and verified. Here's one thing, usually you'll find in greenfield projects, and by that I mean where it's all new construction, new design by the private partner, new construction, and they operate what they've designed and built, that they can accept more of the risk of if your design and building and operation has environmental impacts, you'll be liable for them. If it's a brownfield facility, there was existing, public sector use, it's concessioned or transferred to the private sector, oftentimes you'll get more issues of, well, exactly what are the legacy assets and their risk issues. But oftentimes you can transfer to the private partner at least the environmental risks that they can control directly. Okay, this also, one of the things that should go into a pre-feasibility study is what next? If we're going to do a full feasibility study, well, what are the terms of reference for that? And here we provide an outlined terms of reference for the feasibility study to be done by consultants. Let's see, I'll just jump ahead a little bit. Here was the projected timeline of how much time it would take to complete the feasibility study and then how much time to complete the tender. And then here's how it actually turned out. Interesting case, I think, which is the government actually decided to do this as what we call design, build, operate. Not design, finance, build, operate. So the government said, well, actually, we have a low-interest loan from the Arab Bank for Economic Development in Africa. We're going to use that money, low cost of capital. We'll use that money to actually finance the project. So we shall finance it, but the private partner will design it, build it, and operate it. So that was the approach they took. Capital investment cost, not a huge project, about $6.5 million. They actually designed this, now get this, as an interim storage facility. We said that a PPP, that's a policy decision. They said, we're not going to dispose of hazardous waste here in our country. Instead, we're going to accept it, We're going to package it up temporarily, and then we will ship it overseas for final disposal. That was what the highest levels in government decided that they would do with hazardous wastes. Can't say they're right or wrong, but that's where we say that it's fundamentally these are policy decisions. Now that you know some information about how to identify and select candidate PPP projects, as well as some case studies on how other countries have managed that process, you can test your knowledge by taking the following short quiz that will display on the screen shortly. Please answer each question either true or false. Now that you are familiar with the process for identifying and selecting candidate PPP projects, you can test your knowledge to see what you've learned in this module. For that, my colleague John Budarazzi will be leading you through a group exercise to apply these skills. Please watch what John has introduced, then you can pause the video to carry out the assignment. After that, restart the video and compare your answers with how other groups have answered the same assignment.
So, you've been tasked to identify if a list of projects are suitable as public-private partnerships. You will have on your table, I apologize for the size of the print, you should have a printout of this. I'll show you how this is going to work. So you can pay attention to the screen first. What we're really looking for you to do is we're going to have a decision made whether to proceed as a public-private partnership, whether there's more studying required, or whether it should not be a public-private partnership. One of your very first tasks is at your table, someone needs to be the project leader. Someone is going to have to make sure this gets done and make sure everybody works on time. And then I will be asking the project leader for the results. We have a new bus terminal. You will see with each project, there's a description of the project. It'll talk about how large a project it is, where the revenue's coming from, where it is in terms of being developed, why it's being developed, any support for the projects, the institutions involved, any PPP experience. This could be a hypothetical country. It does not need to be Tanzania or Zanzibar. It could be anywhere. You will also recognize pretty quickly that you don't have all the information you wish you had. This is very early phase of studying a public-private partnership when you usually do not have all your information. So some of it's going to be intuitive. So we have a bus terminal. We have an abattoir. A water treatment plant. We have a hotel. We have a school. We have street lighting. And we have a waste management facility. So you will see there's tabs down here for each project. Bus terminal, abattoir, water treatment. The tabs you have might also include one that says crafts market. You can ignore that. Don't use that. If you want to actually erase it or hide it, be my guest. So all our projects are down here. Wherever it says results, don't worry about. You don't have to open up that tab. Don't worry about it. So for instance, the bus terminal, which is our very first project, you will notice two of the columns have been highlighted in yellow. On the left-hand side, we have project criteria. So the criteria basically, for instance, project objective. And the question or the point of the criterion is, for this case, the project involves the supply of a public service. And you'll see strongly agree is a 5, and there's a scale all the way down to 1, strongly disagree. Your first task is, even before looking at the projects, what I'd like you to do as a group with your table is to look at the weight. There's weights assigned to these criteria. What the weight is, how important do you think it is? If it's super important, like project objective, you might say, well, that should be 60% of the score. Your total weight must add up to 100. So here it is right here. So if it doesn't add up to 100, you didn't do your weights correctly. It's up to you to determine what's important. I'm very curious to see what that is. So you assign the weights to the project. When you decide what the weights are, I want you to use the same weighting for each project. Don't change the weights. It makes it much more simpler for you. You just have to say, okay, Legal authority, we think that's worth 15%. You assign that to the abattoir, to the water treatment, you use the same weights all the way through. Okay, once you determine what the weights are, next what I want you to do, and this is also you will be doing as a group, you will then look at the project and you will make a judgment within your group how important each of these are. Well, you've already done that, but you'll now make a determination, depending on the project, how you will score it, from 5 to 1. And in this column, also highlighted, this is where you type in your score. Very simple. That's all. That's the work you need to do. So that's it. First thing, we got to have a project leader for our teams. And then figure out the weights that you want to use for the projects. All right, good luck. Enjoy. So for the bus terminal, if you click on the results tab, there should be a color. So what is the result? What color is it?
Yellow.
And please read me what it says within the yellow.
The project presents a mix of favorable and unfavorable indicators for PPP delivery. Please consult regional support facility for assistance in screening your project.
So there's more work to be done, okay?
Yes.
That's fine. What about for the abattoir? If you click on the tab that says results for that.
Yellow again.
Okay, so we know what that says.
With
And for the water project?
The same.
So that's also yellow. Okay, fair enough. We'll come back to you. The next table?
Well, for our bus terminal project results, we have green.
Okay, could you read what it says within the green?
It says P3 option should advance to full appraisal and business case stage.
So that means it's going to advance to module 2, which is full feasibility. Okay,
Yes.
Your next project?
Abattoir.
Yes.
And the same. We have green.
Okay, and then your third project is what?
Water treatment.
Okay.
And we also have green.
Okay, we'll come back with more questions. Our next table?
Result for bus terminal.
Okay.
We are having a green.
Green, okay.
Should advance to full appraisal and business case stage.
Okay, and the next project is?
The next project is water treatment.
Okay, for the water treatment?
Similar results, green.
Okay, and then your third project?
Street lighting.
Street lighting, okay.
Also we got green.
Green, okay.
Yeah. We had 3 projects. The first one is water treatment project, and we have a yellow color.
Yellow, okay.
The second one is street lighting project.
Okay.
We have a green.
Okay, do me a favor, and can you read what it says within the red?
Sorry?
No, you said it's red or green?
It's a green.
Oh, it's green, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the last one is bus terminal.
Yes?
It's also green.
Okay. Asante Sana. Let's go to the next table.
To our table, we have 3 projects. New luxury hotel.
Mm-hmm.
And new luxury table, new luxury hotels, we have got yellow.
Okay.
And school, we've got yellow.
Okay.
As well. Waste,
okay, is?
West, we've got yellow.
Okay. And then our last table.
So the hotel results, it's yellow.
And the next project?
The next project is a school.
And the result?
Is yellow.
Okay. And the last project is?
Is west.
And the result?
The color is green.
Green, okay. Very good. All right. So interestingly enough, none of the projects scored a red. If it was a red, it would mean that you would not advance the project to full feasibility. Doesn't mean that it's not a good project, just means it's not suitable as a public-private partnership. You would have to consider other means of funding and delivering the project. So let's have a discussion. So the bus terminal project scored pretty highly, it seems. You should know, and you're probably already aware, there are bus terminal projects that can be delivered, have been delivered as public-private partnerships. They really do have a lot of the attributes for a public-private partnership. What do you think, why would a bus terminal be attractive as a public-private partnership? You can even refer to how you scored the project. What are some of the things that make it suitable as a PPP? It has commercial value, right? Has it been done before, right? So it has a lot of things. Legally, it looks like that you can do that. So there are a lot of attractive options to it, or characteristics to it. An abattoir, I know only 2 teams worked on this. Question for you, it's in there, it's in the material, but where would the revenue come from an abattoir to fund the project if it's done as a public-private partnership? User fees, right? Right? It's split here. One team said green lighted, another said still needed more study, which is fair. The water project. Where would the user fees come from for a water project? What? Oh, I heard it over here. What did somebody say? The tariffs, right? The water tariffs would help fund the project. The hotel, I'm kind of surprised. I thought we might get some red for the hotel. But it didn't. Nobody scored it. None of your groups scored it green as to move forward. Hotels, as I mentioned on our first day, they have been done through public-private partnerships. I'm not sure you necessarily need to do that. Remember, one of the questions we have, it was in here too in terms of public objectives. You have to ask yourself the question, say for a hotel, and I don't mean to pick on hotels, we're in a lovely hotel now, but is the hotel actually in the public interest? If you're the government and you have limited resources to pursue projects, both from financially as well as staff time to pursue the projects, do you really need the government to engage in a public-private partnership? This hotel was built without being a public-private partnership. So it can be done. It's more of a commercial venture than, say, a public interest venture. The school, this is interesting. I'm not surprised that it scored in the middle, it's yellow. Question for you, kind of a little bit of a review question. How would if it's a public-private partnership, how would the school be paid for? Fees? From whom? So when the students go to school, do they put a 5-shilling note in the box every day? What are our 2 modes of payment or revenue in public-private partnerships? We have user fees, and what's the other one? Availability payments. So this would likely be an availability payment scheme that the project, the school, is performing, and as long as the private operator, the private investor, does what they're supposed to do, and the school, the air conditioning's working, the lights are on, none of the windows are broken, they receive their full availability payment. This is surprising, a pleasant surprise, our street lighting project. Back there you had it, and who else had street lighting? I think, did you have street lighting? Maybe that table there. What do you, oh, you did. So if we could have a microphone, what did you like about the street lighting project?
It's a good project. There is efficiency. And the good thing is it will help to cut cost on the use of electricity.
Right.
Yeah, so operation cost will be lower. And so long as the operator, the mode will be the concession, that there will be an advance payment. on the saving of operations. And the saving will be there because of using of solar energy.
Yeah, so you're going to get value for money out of the project.
Exactly.
Right? So it's interesting, in different parts of the world, France is a leader in this. A lot of governments, particularly at the local level, at the municipal level, have been turning to street lighting, public-private partnerships. In the United States of America, where Ned and I are from, our nation's capital, Washington, D.C., the municipal government there is currently pursuing a public-private partnership for its streetlights. So it's become a quite popular thing. The other interesting thing about street lighting is there are very few people that are opposed to it. You know, generally, first of all, we kind of take streetlights for granted, right? And they don't necessarily have a constituency. I will tell you one funny story in Washington, D.C., when they were doing the street lighting project, they had one stakeholder group come out against it. And I don't know if here in Tanzania if you have squirrels, but they're small rodents, little furry creatures, cute little creatures. And they love to run around on the poles and in the trees. And there was a group of stakeholders. They were afraid that the lights were going to be too bright and disturb the squirrels. So they had to address their issue. They're moving forward. The other thing about the street light, it's not simply a pole to hang a light from anymore. The pole has become kind of critical to what they call smart city technology. So they use it for Wi-Fi, for instance. You can use it for that. The solar panel that might generate power for the street light. In some places, it generates enough power that they're able to put the electricity not only to power the street light, but to put it into the grid for the system. I'm sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you. I first concur with the argument of putting street lights, which can be facilitated through PPP. But on the other end, I see there is a challenge because there are two institutions which are now operating at the same time. Formerly, the street lights and advertisements was under the LGAs, local government authorities. But at the moment, the government has changed the regulation and laws. The advertisements has gone to Tarura. Now I'm asking myself, how this PPP project be engaged with Tarura and the LGAs, of which is still responsible for the street lights. That is why I'm giving it as a challenge.
You know, that's a really interesting point, because when we talk about stakeholders, oftentimes what we're thinking of is the external stakeholders, the citizens themselves, but this is an internal stakeholder, right, within government. And I think you have one more comment.
I would like to remind my fellow that Tarura is one of the authority in the government, and also it serves the roads, the street roads. Yes, I know, but the concept is one that there is an opportunity for advertisement, because there is a payment for the permit for installing the advert, and there is a fee charged on the display of the brand.
Right.
And now currently I know it is charged by the Tanzania Revenue Authority, if the law is not changed.
All right, very good. And our last project is our waste management project. The one is green lighted, one needs more study. The waste management projects, Ned gave you a case study earlier today. There have been a number of waste management projects that have been performed as public-private partnerships. Just as a reminder, for a waste management project, where would the fees come from? What kind of fees would these be? Would they be availability payments or user fees? User fees. Usually what they refer to in the industry as a tipping fee. That is for the truck to go into the facility. One of the things about the waste management, this is actually a picture of one that I visited in the Caribbean. It's a public-private partnership. They've also become very good about recycling and repurposing material and reselling it into the market. So they're quite good. They're very good for the environment. one of the things I want to mention, so you worked very intensely. I think we got some good pictures of you working, and I saw some good give and take and some debate. First off, I want to congratulate you, because to do this normally would take maybe a couple of months. You managed to do it in 2 hours. So first of all, congratulations on that. Yeah, I hope what you get from the exercise is kind of a feel that that you have to set your priorities, what is important to you from a policy perspective, regardless of what the project is, in terms of deciding whether to move forward with a project. The matrix I gave you is not set in stone, this right here, okay? This is not set in stone. This is really for purposes of the exercise. The other thing I want you to be aware of, you look at what you did, you had an Excel spreadsheet, it gave you a number, right? It actually gave you a number, even to 1/10 of a point in terms of that number, and it generated red, yellow, green in terms of the outcome. Don't be super fooled by that. I like to call it false precision. If a project scores 7.9, another one scores 8.1, it doesn't mean that 8.1 project's necessarily better. It's really just to give you some direction. There's a lot of thought that goes into whether or not to advance a project. It's not, as this exercise was, it's not simple math. And you could tell that when you were having the discussions within your groups. You know, there's argument that goes back and forth, good-natured argument. You make your points. It's more of an art than a science, all right? So great job today. Let's look at some takeaways from this module. In this module, we learned that not all projects are suitable as public-private partnerships. We must first determine their viability as a public-private partnership. To do that, we will use the planning process of the government, where they've identified projects that will meet the public need. We then will screen those projects for suitability for delivery via a public-private partnership.
I'd like to add some additional points to take away from this module on PPP project identification and selection. The first is that the process of identifying and selecting a PPP candidate project doesn't necessarily mean that it is necessarily feasible or will proceed to tender. To do that, we actually have to carry out the full feasibility study. Secondly, a big challenge on identification and selection is that our data on projects is usually very limited. So we're making decisions based on limited information, and what we're trying to do is find out if the project has the initial indications and looks and feels and smells like it would be a good candidate for PPP. Thirdly, don't make the project selection criteria too detailed or too complex. As I've said, the information available about the project is usually very limited, so we're trying to find out if it's a good candidate, not necessarily a specific quantitative score. Thank you for joining us for this second module on PPP identification and selection. Please join us on the next module, where we'll be talking about Phase 3, which is PPP feasibility study management. Thank you.